A new strain of virus has brought the world to its knees.
The virus, they're working hard. Looks like by April, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
Some countries are managing to protect the public. Others are failing.
We're at war.
This is serious. Take it seriously.
In a race against this deadly disease, political systems compete to prove their superiority.
Wuhan will win. Hubei will win. China will win.
A strong state can be useful.
Sometimes we need to act even when we don't have 100% certainty.
The pandemic has thrown political accountability and personal tragedy into sharp relief. COVID-19 patient, day 1. This 62-year-old woman is running a fever and having trouble breathing. Textbook symptoms of pneumonia. She will spend the next 39 days fighting for her life. We don't film her every day. Some scenes are reconstructions based on her medical records. How does this virus affect our bodies? And where did it come from? Wuhan in central China has a population of over 11 million. This is where the virus was first identified. But is this where it originated? China's critics will later claim that the SARS-CoV-2 strain was created in a lab in Wuhan. According to another theory, it jumped from wild animals to humans at a wet market in Wuhan. Whatever the origin, by December 2019, the city's hospitals were struggling to contain an outbreak of unknown etiology.
In late December, we received a signal that there were a cluster of unexplained pneumonia in Wuhan, China. We had no diagnosis. It could have been flu. And so we activated our networks to verify the event.
In the early days, we all thought this is something that was local, was linked to a single source, and like most single source outbreaks, will come to an end. But yeah, that turned out not to be the case.
One of the first doctors to sound the alarm was Li Wenyang. On December 30th, he warned his colleagues in local hospitals via a private chat group. One hour later, one member wrote, Li replied, Li's worst fears were confirmed when Wuhan authorities moved to silence him. He was interrogated by the police, forced to sign a letter of reprimand and to promise to stop spreading rumors. Time was running out. Liu Peiyan and his family in Wuhan were unaware of the extent of the danger posed by the new virus. In early January, he took his father to his annual medical checkup.
At this point, the news, the online media, and video sites were all reporting that there was no human-to-human transmission. and that the outbreak was under control, and its spread could be avoided.
Today, he believes his father contracted the virus during that routine checkup. On January the 15th, he came down with a fever. But across China, it was still business as usual. Preparations for the Lunar New Year celebrations were underway. Millions of people were traveling across the country to visit family. Meanwhile, Liu Peiyen's father was fighting for his life. He was transferred to a hospital where COVID-19 patients were being isolated.
Coming here triggers hellish memories. My father died on the 12th floor of that building there. This was the evening before he died. He's saying goodbye to my mother via video chat.
He's convinced that his father's death could have been avoided had the Wuhan authorities warned of the virus sooner. While the spread of COVID-19 gathered pace in Wuhan, the rest of the world, Germany included, was focused on other issues.
In Australien ist angesichts der Gluthitze kein Ende der Buschbrände in Sicht.
Der russische Ministerpräsident Medvedev hat überraschend seinen Rücktritt erklärt.
Der britische Prinz Harry und seine Frau Meghan verzichten künftig auf den Titel königliche Hoheit.
Only a handful of scientists understood the gravity of the situation. At the biotech company CureVac in Tübingen, researchers were anxiously awaiting the first novel coronavirus genome sequence.
The talks began after the Christmas break. We agreed to start as soon as the sequence was made available. It couldn't hurt, even if we changed our minds later. We decided to start the same day and not waste any time.
The high-stakes international race to develop a vaccine against the new virus was on. Researchers in Berlin were also getting to work. One of the first diagnostic tests for COVID-19 was developed at Berlin's Charité hospital. Before long, it was apparent that scientists' worst fears were being realized.
Was die Behörden in China jetzt tun, hat es noch nie gegeben. Um die Ausbreitung des neuartigen Coronavirus zu stoppen, hat China mehrere Millionen Städte abgeriegelt.
Wuhan ist eben diese gigantische Stadt von 11 Millionen. Und ich frage mich eben, wie man eine solche Stadt wirklich abriegeln will.
In Hubei province, some 60 million people faced a travel ban and were soon effectively under house arrest. The Liu family was completely unprepared for the lockdown. At first, they had no idea how to even get their groceries. But then the state intervened and appointed managers for each housing compound to help out residents.
We had a WeChat group where people could post if they needed something. You could place your order and then someone would drop it off. It showed us that the government was making a huge effort.
Neighborhood committees were set up to supervise entry and exit points and make sure residents had regular food supplies.
China is a surveillance state. We knew that before the coronavirus crisis. And that paid off in this case, because the state was able to use existing surveillance infrastructure to efficiently impose strict local lockdowns.
The one-party state was effective. but it also made sure any dissent was quashed. COVID-19 patient, day 3. The 62-year-old patient's condition is deteriorating fast. Her breathing is so labored that she requires intubation and artificial respiration. Her lungs are severely inflamed. But by day 5, her condition starts to improve. She's responsive. Things are looking up.
Einen schönen guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Willkommen zur Tagesschau. Das neuartige Coronavirus hat nun auch Deutschland erreicht.
Der Firmensitz des Automobilzulieferers Webasto in Stockdorf. Hier hat sich ein deutscher Mitarbeiter bei einer Kollegin aus China angesteckt.
Wir nehmen auch den Virus sehr, sehr ernst, dürfen aber eben nicht hektisch werden, denn für übertriebene Sorge gibt es keinen Grund.
By January 31st, some 12,000 cases of the new coronavirus had been registered, almost all of them in China. But the first cases outside the country were now also being recorded.
In mid-January, governments were being told to get out their pandemic plans and be prepared. A crisis was potentially unfolding. A number of countries took it seriously because they'd had prior experience.
One of the first countries to launch a rapid response to the coronavirus was Taiwan. Lin Meishun was responsible for containing the spread in her neighborhood.
Hello? 老先生，我是那个里长。好，请帮我开个门，谢谢哈。
Lin Meishun is a township mayor. Some of her new responsibilities include checking up on people who are sheltering at home and bringing them food supplies and reading material. It's a social service provided by the city of Taipei, but it also enacts social control.
Did you check your temperature today?
It was normal.
Do you have a runny nose, fever, cough, any other symptoms?
No, nothing.
Nothing. That's great.
Mr. Mao has just returned from the US. He has to quarantine for 2 weeks. He receives financial assistance while he stays at home.
I cannot leave this apartment because if I brought this cell phone out, then the CDC or the police will know.
Even his garbage is taken care of. A municipal trash collector specifically comes by to pick up garbage from homes of people in quarantine. It's separated from other waste and incinerated. Shen Xianzhen was Minister for Health during the 2003 SARS outbreak that claimed 73 lives in Taiwan.
I think that we have prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic for 17 years. After the SARS outbreak, we came across this H5N1 avian flu, and then that's an H1N1 pandemic flu. So this entire health administration as well as Taiwan CDC have practiced on how to control this pandemic for several times.
That included stockpiling face masks. Unlike in many Western countries, Taiwan ramped up its production of surgical masks. Each person was allowed to purchase 2 every 7 days. Taiwan never imposed a strict lockdown like the one in Wuhan. The small island proved to the rest of the world that it was indeed possible to contain the virus. By late August, only 7 people had died of COVID-19 in Taiwan. Years of preparation, as well as extensive contact tracing, had served the authorities well. The West, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the oncoming threat. Or were they simply indifferent?
9 months from now, we are going to take back the House of Representatives. We are going to hold the Senate, and we are going to keep the White House.
Mit einer großen Gala haben am Abend in Berlin die internationalen Filmfestspiele begonnen.
Glanz, Glamour und Weltstars.
Mehr als 330.000 Kinobesucher werden für die kommenden 10 Tage erwartet.
In den Karnevalshochburgen am Rhein hat die närrische Zeit heute ihren Höhepunkt erreicht.
Der Kölner Rosenmontagszug startet pünktlich um 10 Uhr.
France, too, had yet to ban mass gatherings. The Christian Open Door Church, a French evangelical megachurch. A 5-day rally held here became ground zero for the epidemic in France. There hasn't been a service here for weeks. Pastor Samuel Peter Schmidt is devastated.
Ça fait mal au cœur.
It breaks my heart to see the church so empty. It's especially hard because I know how full it normally is.
Over 2,000 worshippers attended the prayer meeting in mid-February. This annual gathering is a highlight on the church calendar. For 5 days, the community sings, prays, and dances together.
Looking back, I would say the mood was utterly normal. In the rest of the world, everything was still mainly fine. At the time, the problem was restricted to Asian countries, to China.
A false sense of security that proved disastrous for all. On the second day of the gathering, President Emmanuel Macron visited the city of Mulhouse and gave a speech about Islamist separatism just a few hundred meters from the church. He spent an hour shaking hands with members of the public. No one wore masks, no one practiced social distancing. It was mid-February. Large gatherings were still nothing unusual.
Mass gatherings should have been banned everywhere much earlier. Aspects of society that are taken for granted should have been challenged. But no one wanted to make a decision that would have made them politically unpopular.
The pastor's son, Jonathan Peter Schmidt, is a member of the church and a medical doctor. He recalls that on February 21st, the French Ministry of Health released a statement about COVID-19.
On the last day of our rally, the ministry wrote, "There are 12 confirmed cases of COVID-19 on French territory. There is no active transmission chain in France."
Jonathan had already started to feel unwell during the event, but the statement by the ministry calmed his biggest fears.
I read the email and thought, okay, everything's fine. I can't have the virus. But there was a major discrepancy between what we thought we knew and what was really going on.
In fact, he had already contracted the virus. But at this point, there was no way of being sure of anything anymore. When Jonathan heard of the first confirmed COVID-19 case in the community, he was keen to get tested himself. To do so, he had to drive 120 kilometers to a testing center in the city of Strasbourg. France's coronavirus testing capacities were completely unprepared for the onslaught, allowing the virus to spread undetected.
And so by detecting the virus as early as possible is the only way you can break the chain of transmission. Because we know now that this virus is very transmissible at the beginning of the disease. Not so much at the end, but really at the very first days, this is where people are more contagious.
France was slow to realize how far the outbreak had progressed. The religious gathering at Mulhouse contributed to a countrywide infection. Thousands of attendees are believed to have transmitted the virus. By February, China was flattening the curve. In March, the number of new infections in Europe exceeded those in China. A ranking of countries by corona-related deaths per million made Europe the new epicenter of the pandemic.
Das Coronavirus breitet sich in Europa weiter aus und zwingt immer mehr Staaten zu drastischen Maßnahmen.
Frankreichs Kampf gegen Corona. Mindestens 15 Tage soll die Ausgangssperre gelten.
In Rom und in ganz Italien sind alle Geschäfte, Restaurants und Kaffeebars geschlossen.
Die Kritik am Land Tirol und vor allem dem Wintersportort Ischgl als mögliche Keimzellen des Coronavirus in Europa reißt nicht ab.
Pulver, Schnee und blauer Himmel, Riesenstimmung bei der Hüttengaudi, Massenandrang Anfang März in Ischgl.
This was a sorry example of how economic interests can take priority over public health concerns. We assume that 40 to 50% of infections in Germany can be traced back to Ischgl. Had the Austrian authorities intervened sooner, things may have turned out very different in Germany and in Austria.
By the end of winter break in mid-March, it became clear that the virus had reached Germany. Despite the warning signs, the country was not fully prepared. On March 7th, Maren Jonsek-Ort traveled to Switzerland with her family and some friends. No lockdown measures had yet been introduced. The country was considered low risk. But all 7 of them came down with a new virus. They had no idea how they could have contracted it. They hadn't attended any large parties.
We'd never experienced anything like it before. We all felt ill. We all had the same awful symptoms. And all of us had it equally badly. It had us very worried.
Her husband and daughter were the first to show symptoms on the journey home. Once they'd arrived, both Maren and her husband's conditions deteriorated rapidly. Back in Germany, they couldn't even reach a doctor.
We were completely on our own. He wasn't seen by a doctor. He couldn't get any medicine. We were isolated. We were in a bad way. I felt so abandoned. I wondered what would happen if I died. I didn't know how sick I was. I hadn't even seen a doctor.
Eventually, I realized the only option was to call the emergency services. I talked to my sister because my parents were both so sick, and together we decided to call the emergency number.
Maren was transferred to intensive care. She had pneumonia caused by the coronavirus. By now, the health authorities and hospitals in Germany were bracing for disaster. Suddenly, there was growing public concern about the potential impact of a COVID-19 outbreak. The WHO recommends countries stockpile personal protective equipment in order to be prepared for a pandemic. However, there was a shortage in Germany.
The authorities relied on international supply chains. There was this assumption that if they suffered a shortage somewhere, they could order it from China and have it delivered in 2 days. But the supply chain was disrupted.
Meanwhile, politicians and scientists were arguing about the usefulness of face masks.
Sollte jeder in der Öffentlichkeit eine Atemmaske tragen?
Der klassische OP-Mundschutz, den viele tragen, schützt sehr überschaubar, um es so zu formulieren.
Und es ist klar, dass diese Masken die Weiterverbreitung nicht wesentlich verhindern.
It only became mandatory to wear a face mask in shops and on public transport by late April, after the pandemic had peaked in Germany. By then, over 6,000 people had already died. COVID-19 patient, day 9. After initial signs of recovery, her condition has deteriorated dramatically. She has severe difficulty breathing, and the doctors have no experience in tackling this new disease.
We don't know its clinical progression. It's like a marathon, and we're probably only about 22 kilometers into it.
Day 12. The doctors are surprised to detect a bacterial superbug. The patient is administered a high dose of antibiotics.
Okay.
The virus was attacking her organs. As her liver starts to fail, it becomes clear just how unpredictable this new virus can be.
Bund und Länder haben sich auf weitreichende Maßnahmen geeinigt, um die Ausbreitung des Coronavirus einzudämmen. Eine bundesweite Ausgangssperre soll es nicht geben, doch künftig gilt ein äußerst striktes Kontaktverbot.
Um die weitere Ausbreitung des Coronavirus zu verlangsamen, bleiben die meisten Schüler und Kita-Kinder ab heute vorerst zu Hause.
Heute hat die Oberbürgermeisterin verkündet, dass Bars, Clubs, Diskos sowie Kinos und Theater geschlossen bleiben.
Die Bundesregierung hat ein milliardenschweres Hilfspaket auf den Weg gebracht, um die Folgen der Corona-Epidemie abzufedern.
Fortunately, Germany could afford to give not only business, but also the health system a financial boost. Hospitals prepared for the epidemic by earmarking thousands of beds in intensive care for COVID-19 patients. The fact that Germany invests a substantial amount of its resources in healthcare appeared to be paying off.
Wir dürfen auch nicht vergessen, dass vor der Corona
We shouldn't forget that prior to the corona crisis, Germany was often criticized for having too many hospitals, too many intensive care units. Prior to the crisis, this was seen as a flaw in the system. But now, it's proven to be a strength, a bonus, which allowed us to take appropriate measures.
In a further effort to contain the spread of the virus, the government also increased testing capacity. Germany didn't want to make the same mistakes as France or Italy.
There's always an element of luck. Clearly, I think we were lucky that the crisis hit Italy first. It served as a warning to the general public. We also got lucky with the Weberstow cluster, because it taught us a lot about the virus.
Led by Chancellor Merkel, who holds a doctorate in quantum chemistry, the German government followed the advice of experts as it set about tackling the epidemic. By now, the epicenter of the crisis had shifted to the US. New York City began digging mass graves for its countless victims. The White House also consulted with experts. But unlike in Germany, their advice wasn't always heeded.
Da meldet sich Präsident Trump mit ungewöhnlichen Ideen zu Wort und sorgt für Fassungslosigkeit unter Medizinern.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside?
Well, I feel about vaccines like I feel about tests. This is going to go away without a vaccine. It's going to go away, and we're not going to see it again.
Anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there. They have the tests, and the tests are beautiful. Anybody that needs a test gets a test.
Donald Trump failed to keep his promise. New York City lacked the test kits when they needed them the most. The city's health commissioner was growing desperate.
We had been loudly pleading for testing to come to our jurisdiction. And what happened was that, things happen. And the unfortunate story is that the testing kits that we got in New York City didn't work.
Anthony Almojera is a paramedic with the New York City Fire Department. The team has been dramatically reduced as a result of public spending cuts. Hospitals were also feeling the pinch.
You had nurses wearing garbage bags. We're supposed to be America, right? We love going around telling other people what to do. We like to say, look at us, this is the society, right? This is peak civilization. We're wearing garbage bags as PPE. That's embarrassing. That's a shame. Those people that got sick in those hospitals, those nurses and doctors, that's a direct result of that management of that hospital, the management of this city, and the management of this government overall.
The US, a world power, completely mishandled its response to the pandemic. To this day, it still failed to control the spread. Before long, angry Americans were taking to the streets to vent their fury in anti-lockdown protests. The US has no short-term work scheme like Germany's, and no uniform health system. Unemployment has soared during the coronavirus pandemic.
In the US, economic conditions played a greater role than they did in Europe. That's mainly because the US is not a welfare state. It lacks a social security system that's in place, more or less, across Europe.
Phoenix, Arizona, early July. The coronavirus testing facility opens in 2 hours. Tests are free, financed not by the state, but by donations. Neil Mack has been waiting in line since 1 in the morning.
My last day at work was March 31st. So I haven't worked since then, and I don't have any insurance. So this is one of the free places that you can go without insurance.
Many people have no health insurance. The unemployment rate nearly tripled in April. Most here have COVID-19 symptoms, and free testing is the only way they can find out if they have the virus. In mid-July, 25% of tests in Arizona came back positive.
It's shocking how many people really need to be tested, you know? I think we closed last and opened earliest, I think, possibly, and I think that was a huge problem. And I would see people on my app next door complaining about wearing masks or wanting to go to bars and their rights being, taken away, and I just thought that was beyond ridiculous.
Fearful of the economic toll, Arizona was slow to respond to the pandemic. Then, it lifted restrictions too soon. As a result, the number of cases has skyrocketed. The US might be one of the wealthiest nations in the world, but few countries have been as severely hit by the pandemic. COVID-19 patient, day 15.
You try to apply everything you know about medicine, but even then you find yourself overtaken by events.
The patient has developed new symptoms. A life-threatening clot in her lung, a pulmonary embolism. Blood thinners aren't helping. Her circulation is collapsing. The doctors alert the family. By now, doctors have learned that this is a typical development. The virus attacks not only the lungs, but the blood vessels too. Day 22. The patient undergoes a life-saving emergency tracheotomy. Poorer countries have been defeated by the pandemic, such as Nigeria. At night during lockdown, the streets of Lagos are dangerous. Residents have set up a citizens' militia.
Gosa, gosa, gosa.
Attacks are increasingly commonplace. Overwhelmed by the challenges of the pandemic, the state is powerless to intervene.
We went from trying normal public health interventions to going very aggressive with lockdowns of the country, and quickly realizing that this would be impossible to really enforce in our context.
Officially, Nigerians are supposed to stay home for 36 days. Mass gatherings are canceled. 36-year-old Moruf Abdul Salam has lost his job because of the lockdown. He doesn't have any savings. He's a sound engineer and has his own small studio. Events provided him with most of his income. Now that they've been canceled, he's lost his livelihood.
I know staying indoors and social distancing is the best solution to tackle corona, but our government should give us something to eat, even if it comes weekly or monthly, so that we can all survive this pandemic.
He and his wife live with their 4 children in a tiny apartment.
We have been asking our neighbors and close relatives for food and assistance. That is how we have been able to survive.
The public has been given little support during lockdown. The government has a limited food distribution scheme, which has led to stampedes as people scramble to collect the meager supplies offered. In Nigeria, lockdown measures have failed to contain disaster from spreading.
I think it's very important to look at how people are living and say, okay, what would be the best measure to reduce transmission? And then work it out like that, and not just copy and paste what has been done in other countries.
The ideal solution, of course, is a vaccine, one that is widely available. COVID-19 patient, day 27. After the tracheotomy, the patient's condition improved. Today, the nurses managed to help her into a chair. She's awake and can respond to questions by nodding or shaking her head. Recent weeks had seen her condition fluctuate dramatically, but she now appears to be stabilizing. The doctors considered transferring her out of intensive care. We have yet to fully understand this tiny novel virus. Researchers are skeptical if it really only spread from Wuhan to Europe in January. The Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Colmar, France. Michel Schmidt, head of radiology, has examined hundreds of COVID-19 patients and made an interesting discovery.
After what happened in March and April, it occurred to me to look through our records, beginning in the summer of 2019, to see if there was anything unusual.
A lung X-ray made on November 16th showed typical signs of a COVID-19 infection.
What's especially noticeable is this opaque area.
He found another suspicious case in November, 12 more in December.
We thought this was an unusual flu. The patient had a high temperature, a lung embolism, pneumonia, but it didn't add up.
Later, he gave the patients an antibody test. All came back positive. The French radiologist's findings tie in with the studies conducted in other countries. A number of indications suggest that the virus was already spreading around the world in late fall of 2019.
What we know is when the virus has been detected, initially and in Wuhan. But maybe this virus came from somewhere else, or in China or elsewhere. And we don't know really if the really first time this virus emerged was in this market in Wuhan.
At this stage, it seems unlikely. Many scientists believe the virus was transmitted from animals to humans in South China or neighboring countries long before it was detected in Wuhan. But the outbreak in Wuhan marked the start of an international race to find a vaccine. Only a vaccine can stop the pandemic. The company CureVac in Tübingen is hard at work. A vaccine is in production here in this tank. The research is top secret. The company began production in April, hoping to get a head start. It was a high-risk move, but Mariola Fotin-Mleczek is confident she made the right decision when she approved development of a vaccine in January.
Time is of the essence. Everyone is expecting a vast amount of vaccines to be available soon.
The company is pinning its hopes on this substance. Could it be the silver bullet the world is waiting for? Some 30 vaccines are currently being tested on humans right now. Will CureVac's vaccine prove effective and safe in trials?
Dann geht's jetzt los. Wir schalten zur Tat.
Any vaccine that ends up going to market will need to be widely available.
Wir müssen auch letztlich vom Neugeborenen
We need to vaccinate everybody, from 120-year-olds to newborns.
oder versuchen.
Only then can we start to defeat COVID-19,
Dann können wir
when as many people as possible around the world are vaccinated.
von Covid-19 sprechen und die wird dann
We
auch
won't
möglich
achieve
sein,
much
wenn man wirklich
with vaccination
sehr
programs
viele
that are
Menschen
merely
auf der
local
ganzen Welt
or
impfen. Wenn man es
national.
nur lokal oder gar national nur macht, dann kann man damit wenig erreichen.
But inevitably, most governments put the interests of their own people first. Countries that can afford to can order supplies of the vaccine. The race to develop a vaccine has become a race for political power.
Das ist gerade ein antivirales Wettrüsten, das wir da erleben.
Im weltweiten Rennen um einen Impfstoff gegen das Coronavirus steigt der Bund beim Tübinger Biotech-Unternehmen CureVac ein.
Die US-Regierung hat die Investitionen in die Biotech-Firma Moderna auf umgerechnet 860 Millionen Euro verdoppelt.
Die Labore hier im Land sind schnell, aber anderswo auf der Welt haben sie den Ehrgeiz, noch schneller zu sein.
This morning, for the first time in the world, a vaccine against the new coronavirus was registered.
We have repeatedly addressed that China is leading the world in vaccine development for COVID-19.
The pandemic has become political, a battleground in which leading nations vie for power. But when it comes to managing the pandemic, Beijing is far ahead of Washington. China is no longer in crisis, but playing the role of the savior, dispatching PPE and deploying doctors all over the world.
Let's make concerted efforts to protect the life and health of people in all countries.
In the US, the virus rages on, embarrassing the White House administration as it ravages the public. As Trump continues to blame his domestic crisis on China, his America First slogan has never rung so hollow.
China's cover-up of the Wuhan virus allowed the disease to spread all over the world. China has total control over the World Health Organization. We will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization.
The US is losing its world superpower status. And China is eager to take over the leading role it long played in geopolitics.
Das chinesische Modell wird sicherlich nach dieser Krise.
The Chinese model is sure to gain popularity in the wake of this crisis. Given how efficiently China was able to limit the number of deaths and minimize the economic fallout, many are likely to say, look, our democratic systems are too slow, too weak.
Die sind zu langsam, sie sind zu schwach.
COVID-19 patient, day 35. Today, we're allowed to film.
Unbelievable. Yesterday, I thought she was getting better. I thought we'd be able to transfer her soon.
The 62-year-old patient has acute kidney and liver failure. The doctors don't understand. They still don't know what to expect.
You think you're close to the goal. Then someone comes up from behind and tackles you. Her pupils are dilated. Liver failure, massive. We have to respond immediately.
Okay.
Day 38. X-rays show that her abdominal vessels are inflamed. The doctors have never seen anything like it. Her organs are failing, and there's nothing they can do. The patient appears to be losing the fight. Day 39. At 10:02, the patient is pronounced dead. Massive organ failure. the global pandemic has been wreaking turmoil around the world for just over 8 months. In Taiwan, the government continues to manage the situation well. So far, there have only been 500 infections. In Germany, infections are once again on the rise. Like many others, Maren Jonsek-Ort is still suffering from the long-term effects of COVID-19. She still has some difficulty breathing and hasn't fully recovered her sense of taste.
When I see how carefree young people are, I want to shake them and say, guys, you have no idea how much you might suffer if you get this illness.
In early August, Nigeria extended the second phase of the nationwide lockdown by 4 weeks. The country has avoided the worst. Experts wonder if this is because its population is relatively young. In China, after talking to us, Liu Peiyin came under pressure from the police and was forbidden from giving any further interviews. According to Beijing, the economy saw modest growth in the second quarter of 2020. The US economy continues to reel. In November, the country goes to the polls. Trump's response to the pandemic could impact the election. COVID-19 has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide. Over 20 million are infected. The virus clearly isn't under control, and the outlook is far from encouraging.